Okay, so these socks have been made with the stitch in question. This is the inside. These have been worn quite a bit, so it's very indistinct at this point. You can see felting that's occurring on the bottom. Then this is the outside. So that's not crappy embroidery. The inside of it right now is actually the outside. So this is right side out, if that makes sense. But I wanted to show the difference between inside and outside. So there's a bit of a ridge pattern, but it's very indistinct. It's a very, very thick, plushy fabric. And so these are like my best winter socks. These things are excellent. This is a little bit thinner than the brown, but again, these are excellent winter socks in my opinion. These are far more used than the brown ones. The brown ones are the second set that I made. But the fabric is pretty stiff. It will stand on its own, and I have a picture of that. You can just kind of set the sock up and it'll stand. So compare that to the more typical thinner fabric. This is probably some variety of finish stitch. That's my go-to. It's just easy for me to remember. Yeah, you can see it felts together and it creates fabric like an Afghan blanket in a sense. But you can see these thinner areas, you can still see my finger through it, right? If I push, I can still work between the, excuse me, work between the yarns. So then we have, I forget what kind of stitch this is, but this was another fun project. But this is a much tighter fabric, and this hasn't seen a whole ton of use. So there's not a lot of wear on these. And that's mostly just because I'm afraid of wearing them out. I don't want to do that because it took a good bit of work to make them. But these are tightened down around my needle, so you get a very fine, tight weave compared to around the thumb, which gets you something like this. But these were done around the thumb as well. And I can push my finger through here. And there we go. You can just barely see my finger through there. There are more layers to it. It's harder to push your finger into the fabric and get to that point. And then, just as a little aside, good gracious me. Release! Oh, I need tweezers or something. That's not the right needle. There we go, the one that holds everything together. And those are other needles. I prefer bone needles for nail binding. My personal rule is I like them to be about as long as my middle finger or a little bit longer. So if you measure from the top, that's a pretty good length in my opinion. Oh, sorry. If you measure from the top, that's a pretty good length in my opinion. But bottom works as well too. And that's just because I have gotten involved in some long projects. You put in a lot of hours, and I've sat and put lots of hours in one sitting. And what I have found in these experiences of Nålbinding for hours on end is I really prefer a longer needle to a shorter needle, because with a shorter needle, you end up just pinching it between your fingers, and that can lead to hand fatigue. Whereas with a longer needle, you can support it in your hand like this. I like to rest the head of the needle in my palm much like this. Because if I'm pinching it all the time, you do end up with hand fatigue. And so if it's long enough to comfortably rest in your palm, and then have an end here which you can manipulate, your fingers are really just guiding it. It's resting here in my palm, the tip is doing work off my thumb, and then it's just, boop, send it around, draw everything through, and so you don't get that pinching hand fatigue from manipulating the needle this sort of a way. So, just my opinions and preferences. Bone needles are so smooth, they're worth it. Or, antler's kind of the same thing. But my personal preference is there with regard to needles. But yeah, that's my own little made-up stitch. Probably actually isn't my own. Someone somewhere probably did this or something like it. And I'm just too ignorant to know that they have done it, so I'm calling it my own. We'll just think of it that way. Because not much new under the sun. But just wanted to share that stitch because I am a fan. Figured it out and I said, you know what? I like that. It's a nice thick fabric. A couple other notes about this fabric. If you are working off of your thumb and you aren't using a round start, let's say you're just making a long string and you're going to connect it back to itself at some point in the future, the one downside with this stitch is it very much does have a tendency to twist, and that can be a little bit annoying if starting that way. If you give yourself a round start at the toe, it's a bit more stable. It will twist and curl on itself, but at that point you're just working with one piece of fabric, so you can always manipulate it easily. Whereas if you have a long string, a long chain of stitches that you're going to connect back around to itself, it can be a little bit tricky, be a bit of a headache to untwist everything and then make sure that you are connecting in a nice straight line, so that way you don't have a funky start